So the funny thing about this all is the fact that I'm actually in a semi-abandoned looking classroom right now, like in the fucking depths of my school, but you gotta find a quiet place to record every now and then, and sometimes it's a little bit unorthodox. All right, let's see what these idiots been doing. God damn, this teacher been fucking snacking. Jesus Christ. But you know what? We in here. To summarize, last time we spoke, we talked about how Kawasaki was kicking ass and taking names when it came to muffs per hour. They built 3 bikes in a row that held the top spot 3 times in a row, starting with the GPZ 900R, then the GPZ 1000RX, followed by the Ninja ZX-10. I should also mention that a viewer by the name of AJ mentioned that the 900 actually continued being made until 2003, but only in Japan. The 1996 number was when they pulled it out of the US, but Japan really seemed to love that bike. The last video ended with a bit of a cliffhanger, so hopefully if you went in not knowing all the details of the Top Speed War, you didn't get too curious and run off without me to that Wikipedia page. But let's get moving. Again, Kawasaki was on a tear and were impressively outpacing themselves, let alone everyone else. Japan was producing some killer bikes, and as usual, the engineering was polished, the factor of function was top-notch, and the new upcoming decade of the 90s really held new possibilities in terms of technological advancement for the bikes. The last bike we left on was the Kawasaki ZX-10, and that bike dropped in 1988 and ran until 1990. But it didn't hold the record for the entirety of its model run. The next bike that claimed the top spot is super impressive, but is also at the same time a bit of a cheat. We spoke about Kawasaki and Honda, but what were Suzuki and Yamaha up to at this time? This is the Top Speed War of Japan after all. Well, let's talk Yamaha. Yamaha were building very solid bikes from 1985 onward, and even though they didn't melt faces with the top speed records like Kawasaki, they were still developing their own trademark technology and putting it into their road bikes.
When you set out to build a performance motorcycle like Yamaha's new Seika 750, it helps to know something about performance.
Don't follow anyone. That's the way life should be.
At Yamaha, we don't build great motorcycles to win races. We win races to build great motorcycles.
So to catch you up on Yamaha's technology in bikes, I'm gonna have to put the Speed War on a pause for a second, if you don't mind. And I'll try to sum up Yamaha in 120 seconds or less as a wee little tangent to this whole thing. I just want to highlight some of the signature tech of Yamaha that came out of this era. In 1985, Yamaha dropped the FZ750. Yes, Yamaha was actually using the FZ tag back in the 80s. It had, of course, the 750cc inline-4 liquid-cooled dual-overhead cam engine. But here's the super radical, pioneering, whoa shit though. The FZ750 had 5 valves per cylinder. It was a 20-valve engine instead of the typical 16-valve. Basically, Yamaha was using the claim that by using 3 intake valves, air and fuel flow was improved over those barbaric 2 intake valve engine 2 valves. By dividing the intake duty between 3 valves instead of 2, Yamaha was able to decrease the weight of the valves themselves and thus use valve springs with softer tension, which allowed them to open and close faster. You get it? Better power delivery, and basic physics allow for more power overall. But remember, this was just a 750, so even though it had that fancy valve system, there was still 250 cubic centimeters of boom to add to the technology and capitalize on it even more. Other notable things is how the engine was designed to slope forward in the frame, which was not really seen that much back then. So it lowered the center of gravity but also stretched out the wheelbase. Another technological trademark of Yamaha was the Delta Box frame, which was first adopted on the 1985 TZR 250. The bike itself was a 250cc 2-cylinder 2-stroke, and that's pretty cool and unique in its own right, but the bike itself isn't really important right now. What is important is the frame that it used. The Delta Box was unique because where other twin spar frames had the 2 beams jet outward pretty far sideways from the steering head and then backwards, which was basically to create enough space for the engine to sit up and in the frame, the Yamaha philosophy was to make those 2 beams shoot backwards as straight as possible to create what is closer to a triangle instead of a square, hence the Delta in the Delta Box name. The Delta Box frame started on the small 250, but eventually Yamaha had figured out how to employ it on big bikes. Hell, my 90s YZF 600R was built with one of those, and it was during a time where they were heavily advertising the Delta Box frame, like very adamantly. It's the fucking future. It allows for the engine to be mounted much lower and lowers the center of gravity as well for better handling. Add a lightweight material like aluminum. Consider that a triangle is more stable in its application, and you'll realize that Yamaha was truly onto something when it came to this. Alright, so with that said, let's get back to the Speed War. In 1987, Yamaha dropped the FZR 1000, which was impressive but not extremely noteworthy until you get to the 1989 facelift. In 1989, Yamaha took the FZR 1000 and retooled the motor a little bit and followed up by adding a system that they call X-Up. See, this is the stuff that I miss about the 80s and the 90s, man. These ridiculous over-the-top names. X-Up stood for Exhaust Ultimate power valve. Basically, it was an exhaust valve that was added to the collector pipe and the headers that would open and close partially depending on the RPM to manipulate the back pressure, scavenging, and fuel flow, stuff like that. If it were today, the system would be called something way more lame, not no X-up. And it didn't even make sense back then because they omitted the V for valve. Never forget the V. The 1989 FZR was faster than the Tomcat with a speed of 167 miles per hour. And it also had a pretty impressive 0 to 60 of 2.9 seconds and a horsepower rating of 145 at the crank and 132 at the wheel. Not bad at all. The FZR 1000 X-up 5-valve Delta box was the ultimate amalgamation of Yamaha's technology, but as it turns out, it could still be improved a little bit more for speed. So who exactly took up that task? Yes, sir. Italia had been sidelined ever since the Ducati Supersport 900 and the Laverda from the 1970s were sidelined. So how did they get back into the game of speed? Through Bimota. If you haven't heard of the manufacturer Bimota, I'm not surprised because they're very small and they were founded just only in the mid-70s. But they're still around today, and as with any Italian brand, their bikes are damn nice to look at. Exclusivity is also even higher than the other European brands somehow. And they've really come into their own, but back then they were just a manufacturer that kind of reworked and customized models from the Big Four in Japan to homologate bikes for their race team. That's why I mentioned that little slight cheat comment thing. Bimota had taken the engine and whatnot from an FZR and developed their own bike around Yamaha's platform. In 1989, Bimota had thus given us the YB6 X-up. The engine was practically untouched from the FZR into the YB6, dual overhead cam, 20-valve, carbed, 147 horsepower, but the thing is that the YB6 chassis was super light compared to the FZR. It was able to achieve a very impressive top speed of 170 miles per hour. Aluminum frame and swing arm, lighter, more open exhaust, Brembo brakes, and the best suspension that Italy had to offer. Luckily, Bimota kept all of the Yamaha electricals and switchgear because, let's face it, Japan is way better at that. After all was said and done, the bike weighed over 50 pounds less than the original FZR. The wet FZR was 520 pounds. The YB6 X-up was a homologation special, and thus they only really built like 114 of these machines, and it was mainly just for track approval. Good luck finding one of these things these days. Even though Bimota kind of used the Japanese design for their base to build on, you still gotta respect what they brought to the table with that bike. A collaboration between Italy and Japan. Racing passion and refinement. Form and function. Yin and yang. Perfectly balancing power and weight. Yeah, but here comes big bad Kawasaki. A little bit miffed that the runt of the litter Yamaha, some third-rate Italian shed company, had somehow linked up and managed to make 165 miles per hour look slow. So what do you think Kawasaki did to exert its speed freak alpha male status? More boom. On top of simply adding 100 cubic centimeters of boom over the ZX-10, they also added a ram air intake system, which was the first on any production motorbike actually. That's kind of why the face of the ZX-11 is kind of like basically the ram air system would increase the power at higher speeds when the air is being forced directly into the airbox through a series of hoses around the front fairing. Ram air systems are pretty common nowadays on motorcycles, but Kawasaki pioneered the technique. See, the ZX-11 could be described as a fulcrum in which everyone, and I mean everyone, started to take notice of the speed war going on. Governments, the public, magazines, journals. Every single publication had to attempt to max out the bikes for themselves to publish official test results. This is what makes the speed war of the 90s so full of myth and theory. It's the fact that everyone had a different say about what the bikes could get up to, what they could do, what they personally got the bikes up to, what they heard a friend of a friend got the bike up to. For the 90s, pay attention to the very wide ranges of the claimed top speeds. The lowest publicized speed was 169 and highest was 176, which was the speed published by Cycle World in 1990. The ZX-11 was also a fulcrum in the sense that the super fast 170 mile per hour plus bikes of the 1990s were all kind of fat, heavy, and big, and they pretty much doubled as fantastic touring bikes. Eventually, these high displacement, torquey, stable bikes started to literally fill out their own niche and market. You can actually kind of see this through how long the models would run for compared to how they did in the 80s. The manufacturers would start to build the nimble, fast, and lightweight machines alongside the big straight line beasts. The lumpy look of the ZX-11 is also the true nature of aerodynamics. The boxiness of the 80s had to give way to love handles. The ZX-11 was impressive because of all the bikes we spoke about, it actually held its record of top speed the absolute longest. When the ZX-11 received an update in 1993, some people claimed that the improvements to the intake and the exhaust actually pushed the bike to a new top speed of 180 miles per hour, but I can't really find much information on that, to be honest. Remember when I mentioned how much the war was picking up in the public eye as well as in the manufacturer boardrooms? Remember how Kawasaki left Honda in the dust for almost a decade now? Actually over a decade. Turns out that Honda had enough being side-chicked and wanted to produce the world's fastest production motorcycle. Let me explain the mistake Honda made though when they had jumped back into the game. See, While Kawasaki would simply double down by mainly just increasing the displacement of their bikes and improving the fuel systems, Honda decided to combat an 1100 class bike with another 1100 class bike. Granted, the Ninja was a 1052cc bike, and the bike that Honda dropped was a 1137cc bike, but anyway, the CBR 1100XX Super Blackbird. And you fucking know what? Name of this bike beats every single bike on this list. You see, this is that old school vehicle naming thing I mentioned. They didn't have to put no fucking X in there, let alone 2 X's. It's not just a Blackbird, it's a motherfucking Super Blackbird.
Hell, baby, I ride a XX Super Blackbird. Fastest bike in the world.
It's named after the SR-71 Blackbird, which is one of the coolest planes ever. And the SR-71 Blackbird was also the fastest plane in its time, so you know, Honda was being a little bit cheeky with that title. The Blackbird was equipped with the usual, an inline 4 16 valve, the whole 9 yards. It had a ram air system and that lumpy aerodynamic bodywork, which propelled it up to 180 miles per hour. Now, the CBR left the factory with Honda claiming that it could hit 190 miles per hour, but unfortunately, no, it could not. Nobody got it that far. But 180 is plenty fast, but the thing is, it pretty much put the Blackbird on the level of the revised 1993 ZX-11. See, this is my point from earlier where I mentioned that Honda simply had too much class and just didn't decide to build a 1200cc class bike to beat out Kawasaki. Remember, the ZX-11 dropped in 1990 and the CBR in 1996. That means that surely anyone would bring a 1200cc to the table at any moment with such a long gap. To this day, people actually often debate which is faster, the revised ZX-11 or the Blackbird. In reality, it's a bit of a wash and both could probably claim 180 miles per hour, but the CBR was a new kid on the block though, and at that time, most people accepted that it was faster. The Blackbird had the typical Honda fit and finish, link brakes, fuel gauge, and good touring-oriented ergonomics. The original run of the Blackbird used carburetors, but later on, Honda switched to fuel injection because the Blackbird actually ran all the way to 2007. An instructor at the MSF course where I learned how to ride was actually running one of these. No one in the class really even knew it existed. His bike was super clean and original because he was the one who actually bought it back in the day, brand new. We were surprised to learn how old it was because the bike actually kind of holds up decently well. He was schooling us on how it was actually the fastest bike before the Hayabusa came along. Yep, 1999. Suzuki comes out of left field and absolutely smokes everything, everyone. 1999. Suzuki sends every single manufacturer running away with their tails between their legs. 1999, Suzuki releases the GSX 1300R Hayabusa. 1,299 cc's of goddamn insanity. Hayabusa, Japanese for a type of falcon that eats blackbirds. Falcon, known to be the fastest of any other type of bird. Suzuki capitalized on the CC deficit and beat everyone to the punch. The thing is, they knew that a 1200 was coming, so they dropped a goddamn 1300. This is the big dog. This is the final word. This is the atomic bomb to the Pacific Theater. We spoke about Kawasaki, Honda, hell, we even spoke about Yamaha, but what was Suzuki doing? Watching, waiting, and then power move. See, you can't even mention Busa without mentioning the fact that it put the fear of God into politicians. 194 miles per hour? Cycle World got it up to 194, and you know what? The absolute lowest result from a speed test was 184, and that still trumps every single bike before. You like to average out? Fine, call it 190. Doesn't change a thing. You couldn't debate this bike. You could argue all you want about the ZX-11 versus the Blackbird, but you shut up when someone says Busa. And you know what? Word on the street was that this thing could hit 200 out the box. I mean, nowadays we know that that's not really true. You gotta do a little bit of work to it to hit 200, but the hype around this bike was just that strong, especially at the time. Remember how I mentioned that Suzy just knew a 1200 was coming? Guess what dropped in the year 2000? Exactly, the Ninja ZX-12R. An undoubtedly beautiful bike, small, shapely, aggressive looking. It's a little lighter, and it even made a little bit more power than the Busa.
Now up front you can see what I'm calling the giant pooper scooper. That's the ram air duct, which Kawasaki says adds actually 12 brake horsepower when you're going at full chat, which is a hell of a lot. Some people have said, why isn't it flush? Well, if it was flush, according to aircraft technology, you lose a lot of that fresh air intake. You just lost on the aerodynamics. And this brand new engine produces 180 brake horsepower. That's a lot of ponies, that is. And look up here, fuel injection. The bike feels much lighter than it is, more like a 600 than a 1200, but open that throttle and you know it's a 1200.
But the damage had already been done. See, even if the ZX-12 could outpace the Busa, Suzuki had already gotten in the final word before governments and people just concerned with safety all started to notice. The Hayabusa was 550 pounds wet, fuel injected, because get that carb shite out of here, and it made about 173 horses at the crank, with 155 of those horses stampeding out of that 190 rear tire. By then, Europe had enough. Enough was enough. If the Busa was able to push to 194 miles per hour, it was only a matter of time before the next manufacturer would officially break that 200 mile per hour barrier. And what's worse is the thought of a bunch of thirsty street racing bikers chomping at the bit for a few of those ridiculous 200 miles per hour bikes. Nope. So legislators from Europe say, yo, you clowns keep this shit up and we may have to either heavily tax the shit out of these ridiculous bikes or we may just outright ban them. Party done. Just like that. Suddenly, just like that, the war was over with a simple threat. Europe basically played the part of the neighbors calling the cops on the party next door. Suddenly, it was potentially extremely problematic to produce ridiculous bikes that could potentially eclipse 200 miles per hour out the box. The common understanding is that the Busa directly caused this, but it was also in part caused by the not even yet released ZX-12R and the rumors and hints from Kawasaki that the 12 would hit 200 miles per hour and beat the Busa. Europe said, oh no it ain't. Now, regular car reviews briefly covered this war in their Hayabusa review, and they mentioned a fabled letter from the Japanese government that got sent to the Big Four. Now, I can't find any information on this letter, but it was supposedly to the tune of, "Stop, you idiots!" And in any case, that would really only serve to further quell this epic war. So what happened? Well, the Big Four basically agreed to place limiters on their bikes to keep them at speeds just under 190 miles per hour in the year 2000. It was a gentleman's agreement, which basically means that there was no real paperwork, no official meeting, nothing. In reality, it was just a method to beat legislators to the punch because sometimes it's just better to take things into your own hands rather than let the law do it. If the Big Four would have continued to carry on, no doubt super fast bikes would begin to be banned in some markets, and it's damn hard to reverse anything codified in law. The thing about the Busa though is that it predates the agreement by 1 year and a few months. What that means is that all of the 1999 Busas are unrestricted and will absolutely get up to 190 plus miles per hour. And since the agreement came into effect in the middle of the year 2000, some year 2000 Busas actually also slipped through the cracks and are unrestricted. But every single Busa after that, from 2000 onward to even today, because yeah, Suzuki is still making this thing, is limited to 186. It's mind-boggling how we can even call 186 limited. But that's the state of affairs these days. And then the ZX-12R dropped and all examples of it were limited to 186, and that bike ran from 2000 to 2006. And then, actually, Kawasaki replaced that bike with the ZX-14 in 2006, which was also unfortunately limited to, yes, 186. But up there in that big three, the Busa, the 12, and the 14, lies a culture of underground top speed and tampering with limiters, turbos, drag racing, modifications that has the top speed war continuing in garages as opposed to assembly lines. I always do this, make videos a little bit too long. Alright, let's wrap this up already. The legacy of the Hayabusa is still felt today. You don't have to know the whole story to know the Busa. Everyone knows it. Since 1999, it's still one of the fastest bikes on the road today. So, is there anything breaking records today? Yeah, well, sort of. I already mentioned the Cowies that came after the Busa, the 12 and the 14, but there's also the BMW S1000RR that's pushing 200 horsepower at the crank with a top speed of 188. Limited, of course. MV Agusta claims that the F4R can get into the 190s, but in all the tests conducted, it never actually did. The Ducati Panigale R is said to be able to hit 202 miles per hour, but only with an unrestricted full exhaust system by Termi that's only available to use on the track because it's not road legal. Then there's Kawasaki's love child, the supercharged H2 and H2R. The street legal H2 is said to be limited at 183 miles per hour, while the unrestricted, even more powerful track only, not legal for the street H2R, was able to hit 250 miles per hour in Turkey in 2016. Sheesh. So what's next? Will these insane 200 miles per hour bikes end up on a road in the near future? Will governments ever bring themselves to be able to overlook such a thing? The Big Four manufacturers get that itch and say, fuck this agreement bullshit. I don't know, but you know what? I'll be watching from a safe distance and hedging my bets on that green beast, Kawasaki.